Today, we are here to discuss the goal analysis. The goal analysis within the local control and accountability plan for the 2025 LCAP. As I mentioned before, the resources, the PowerPoint is available in the resources tab, so you can access that there. This is another one of our ongoing series of webinars related to the 2025-26 LCAP, the Local Control and Accountability Plan. Next week, we'll go into the local indicators and then talk about goals and actions. And then in 2 weeks, we'll be focusing on increased or improved services. And then a couple in January following the holiday break. The template files are available. They're on the California Department of Education's Local Control and Accountability Plan webpage. We've also linked them here in the PowerPoint, so if you need access to those, they're available here. The purpose of today's webinar, as I've already mentioned, is to provide an overview of the goal analysis section within the Local Control and Accountability Plan. We'll look at the template, we'll look at the instructions, we'll talk about the update process, and provide some suggestions related to that. The intended audience for this is really anybody that works with the LCAP. This is something that's going to be applicable to folks that are doing educational partner engagement. It's going to be applicable to folks that are developing the LCAP, that are reading the LCAP. So pretty much anybody that's working with that document. Now, getting into it today, if we remember back to the foundational principles of the local control funding formula, you might remember that it's based on multiple measures of success. It's based on a focus on equity, and there's subsidiarity that's there. And when we're talking about the goal analysis, we're looking at those multiple measures of success. We're looking at a variety of pieces of information that are available in order to identify, our improvements, what the challenges have been, etc. We're also evaluating, the process of equity. How effective have we been in increasing or improving services and looking at the outcomes of those actions. Then we're also looking at subsidiarity and what takes place at the local level and using that locally available data and the input from your educational partners in order to drive the changes that will be made to the plan. If you remember, the LCAP, the LCAP is intended to serve a three-pronged purpose. The development process supports comprehensive strategic planning, certainly reviewing, going back, looking at what has happened already is a part of that comprehensive strategic planning. We're probably all familiar with Plan, Do, Study, Act, PDSA cycles, and that's certainly a part of our planning. Meaningful engagement of educational partners is another aspect of this work in terms of getting input from our educational partners and looking at how it is that they've been involved in the process, as well as what their insights are on the information that we've gathered, both at the state level and at the local level. And then accountability and compliance. How are we ensuring that those things that are required are being addressed and met? So let's look at the template itself. Just as a reminder, there is no standalone annual update template for this year. We are instead working with the goal analysis, and that includes 4 prompts that are there. A couple of these prompts are slightly different than they were in that standalone annual update process. So we'll be going over those just to make sure that everybody understands what's a part of that. In addition, there's 3 of the 5 expenditure tables that are part of the annual update, or that are linked to the annual update. We have the annual update table itself, which identifies the planned expenditures as well as the estimated actual expenditures for all of the actions within the LCAP. But we have the contributing actions annual update to template, which looks at only those actions that are contributing towards increasing or improving services for low-income English learner and foster youth students, and specifically, how that requirement has played out throughout the year. And then also the LCFF carryover table for LEAs that have not met their obligation to increase or improve services during the year. What percentage of their unmet responsibility to increase or improve services is being carried over into the coming year? So these 3 tables, action tables, are part of the annual update process. So let's go ahead and look at more in depth at each of the prompts and the instructions that accompany those. We've said it before on other webinars. We'll say it again. It's really important to pay attention to the instructions if you're writing the LCAP, because the instructions provide the basis for what has to be addressed within the prompt. If you just go off of the prompt itself, you're not going to have sufficient information to respond to what's required. And you probably aren't going to end up with an approvable LCAP if all you're doing is focusing on what's identified within the prompt. So there are 4 prompts within the goal analysis section. Let's go over them. The first prompt here is a description of the overall implementation, including any substantive differences in planned actions and actual implementation of those actions, and any relevant challenges and successes experienced with implementation. So if we look at the instructions here are asking to describe the implementation of the actions to achieve the goal. This is required to include a discussion of relevant challenges and successes experienced with the implementation process. And it also has to include any instance where the LEA did not implement a planned action or implemented a planned action in a way that was substantively different from how it was described in the adopted LCAP. So, we can flex things throughout the school year. We can change things, make some adjustments as we go along based on what's happening. Those adjustments and changes that get made need to be described here in this first prompt. Now, a couple of things to consider related to this first prompt. First of all, this prompt refers to the programmatic implementation of actions that are included in the goal, and it documents the LEA's implementation for that year. It's really focusing in on that implementation process and how the implementation has occurred for each of the actions that's identified within the goal. The response has to include a discussion of successes and challenges in implementation. And also it has to note any actions that were not implemented. In the previous year, one of the things that we saw with LEAs is there were times when some LEAs they called out challenges or they called out successes. Maybe they didn't hit both of them, or it wasn't clear if there were challenges or successes. It needs to be clear, what the challenges, what the successes were, so that your educational partners have that understanding. Also, if there's no challenge, if there aren't any challenges to implementing, or there aren't any successes in implementing, hopefully that's not the case, but just in case, then that needs to be called out within the response to this prompt, so that it's not just, looking at some sort of blanket statement saying that all actions were implemented, the end. It's really intended to provide the community, but also the LEA, with additional information on what that implementation looked like throughout the year. And that's important because, as a lot of us are aware, there's frequently turnover within the LEA. And this is a great place to provide some historical reference for folks that come in afterwards, whether that's staff within the LEA, whether that's folks on the local governing board, whether that's folks that are new to the community, to be able to refer back to the implementation of particular actions within goals, or actions in general within goals, provides some historical context so that folks can go back and say, well, you know what, we tried that 2 years ago, and here were the struggles that we had with implementation. It really provides that information for folks to be able to go back and reflect on. It's not simply intended to, be this one-time thing that we fill out and forget about. You know, I'm a former history teacher, and one of the favorite things for history teachers or historians to say is that those that don't know or don't understand the past are doomed to repeat the mistakes and failures of the past. So this is an opportunity to kind of offset some of that piece. Moving on to prompt two. Prompt two within the goal analysis is asking for an explanation of material differences between budgeted expenditures and estimated actual expenditures, and or planned percentages of improved service and estimated actual percentages of improved service. If you're familiar with the LCAP, then you probably are aware that the planned percentage of improved service and estimated actual percentage of improved service are related to the increased or improved services requirement. If you're new, that's probably something that you're not familiar with. Don't worry, we're going to get to that at our webinars on the 17th and the 19th, when we're talking through the increased or improved services section. For now, you can just kind of set that aside, make a mental note that this is something that you'll learn more about later on. When we're talking about the instructions for this particular prompt, it's asking to explain the material differences between the budgeted expenditures and estimated actual expenditures, and between planned percentages of improved service and estimated actual percentages of improved service, if that's applicable. Then it goes on to state that minor variances in expenditures or percentages don't need to be addressed, and that a dollar for dollar accounting is not required. And so let's talk a little bit more about this as we think about things to consider. Prompt two really relates to the fiscal implementation of the actions that are included within the goal. It's important to note here that there's no definition of what constitutes a material difference. Each LEA has to determine on their own what the threshold for a material difference is, based on its local conditions and its educational partners. Some communities are going to want to know things that, even if they're relatively small, they're going to want to know what sorts of changes fiscally occurred related to actions within a particular goal. Other communities are not really going to care all that much. They're not going to pay all that much attention. And so based on your local community and what it is that you need to, who it is that you need to address, take that into consideration when making that determination around what a material difference is versus not. Also, it's important to look at whether or not there were major changes in funding that occurred, or any changes towards the increased or improved services that need to be documented. This is the place to do it. And then if there's no material differences in funding, or there's no significant changes in increased or improved services, then again, that should be documented. A simple statement saying there were no material differences goes a long way towards communicating what's going on for our educational partners and for the community, and for your LCAP reviewers, if you're a county office or a school district. So let's move to prompt 3. Prompt 3 is probably of all 4 of the prompts, is probably the meatiest of them. Prompt 3 asks for an explanation of how effective or ineffective specific actions were in making progress towards the goal during the 3-year LCAP cycle. So just remember, like it states here, this determination is ultimately related to the 3-year LCAP cycle. The response will look at the particular year. This is year 2. We're going to go into year 2 of the 3-year cycle. The 2025-26 school year is year 2 of the current 3-year LCAP cycle. Based on that, you're going to be reporting out related to the implementation of year 1. You're not going to be able to know in most instances whether or not your actions are effective or ineffective at the end of 1 year. That's why it's really going to be important to take into account the full 3 years of the cycle and ensure that you're using that. And we'll get to that a little bit more as we go through this. So the instructions ask you to describe the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of the specific actions in making progress towards the goal during the 3-year LCAP cycle. Effectiveness means the degree to which the actions were successful in producing the desired result, and ineffectiveness means that actions did not produce any significant or desired result. When we're talking about effectiveness versus ineffectiveness, effectiveness is determined because there is data that you have available that shows that something that there's progress being made in a positive direction. And ineffectiveness comes kind of in 2 forms. In one form of ineffectiveness is in instances where the action, we've gathered our data, we've looked at the data that we have related to these particular to this particular action, and the action is not showing any difference within the metrics at all. So there's no change. That's one form of ineffectiveness. Another form of ineffectiveness is when we gather all our data, we look at it, and we say, well, you know what? The data that we've gathered really does not align with what this action is. We don't have a way to measure the effectiveness of this action. If we don't have a way to measure the effectiveness of the action, that is also ineffective. Just because we don't have data does not mean that the action in and of itself is necessarily ineffective. But if we can't measure it, we can't say that it's effective. So that's the sort of thing that we're looking at here. Now, just as a reminder, in some cases, not all of the actions within a goal are intended to improve the performance on all of the metrics within the goal. You're going to have some actions that are tied to particular metrics. It's not expected to have all of the metrics within a particular goal addressing all of the actions within a particular goal. So make sure that you're paying attention to those groupings. Continuing on with the instructions go on to say, when responding to this prompt, LEAs may assess the effectiveness of a single action or a group of actions within the goal in the context of performance on a single metric or group of specific metrics within the goal that are applicable to the actions. Basically, you can group actions, you can group metrics, you can have a group of metrics that applies to a single action, you can have a group of actions that applies to a single metric. As we look to incorporate Learning Recovery Emergency Block Grant funding, LREBG funding, into the 2025-26 LCAP, there might be instances where you might have a metric within a goal that is not only addressing the state priorities, but it's also addressing a student group that's in the red in an equity multiplier goal, as well as something that's being addressed by your LREBG actions within the plan. All three of those roles are being fulfilled by a single metric or potentially by a group of metrics, and that's fine. Just having that, knowing what that connection is, though, is important, and is something that you need to make sure that you're keeping track of as you're tying those metrics to those particular actions. One of the places that this comes out most clearly is in the increased or improved services section. Again, we haven't had our training on that, but those of you that were around last year that did the LCAP, that reviewed the LCAP, you're aware that within the increased or improved services section, there's a requirement to identify specific metrics for actions that are being provided on an LEA-wide or school-wide basis. And those have to be called out within the increased or improved services section. There's a clear tie there between those particular metrics that have to be included within the plan, and within that particular, within a particular goal, as to how the effectiveness of that LEA-wide or school-wide contributing action is being effective. So that's something to keep in mind as we're considering effectiveness or ineffectiveness. What metrics are being used in order to demonstrate that. The instructions go on to say that grouping actions with metrics will allow for a more robust analysis of whether the strategy the LEA is using to impact a specific set of metrics is working, and increased transparency for educational partners. LEAs are encouraged to use such an approach when goals include multiple actions and metrics that are not closely associated. And then the last piece of the instructions for this is this note that beginning with the development of the 2024-25 LCAP, the one that's currently being implemented, LEAs are required to change actions that have not proven effective over a 3-year period. So some points to consider when we're thinking about this effectiveness piece, effectiveness or ineffectiveness. First of all of the actions within the goal have to be identified as either effective or ineffective as part of that response. It's not we're identifying some of the actions as effective and leaving other actions out. They all have to be in there. Identification of those actions can be action by action. You can identify each action individually as either effective or ineffective, or you can group like actions as being effective or ineffective. Again, as I mentioned earlier, if it can't be determined that an action produced any significant or desired result, then the action needs to be identified as ineffective. But continuing on with what I was saying about the LCAP cycle, since 2025-26 is year 2 of the current 3-year cycle, LEAs are not going to be required to change actions that are identified as ineffective during this year. They're only going to change, that requirement will only kick in after the full 3 years of implementation. So in general, for most LEAs, you're not going to change an action. You're not required to change an action if it shows as being ineffective in year 1, based on the outcomes that you have. When we get to the end of year 3, if it's shown to be ineffective, then that action has to be changed. But at the end of year 1, when we're looking back at the what was achieved in year 1, when we're looking back at what was achieved in year 2, we don't have to. We're not required to make any changes to that goal, or not to the goal, to the action. So just keep that in mind, that at this point in time, identifying an action as ineffective does not mean that you have to cease doing that action. It doesn't mean you have to make any changes to that action. We're allowing time for the action to play out, right? Because we might not see results in year 1. We might, have to wait another year or 2 in order to see results from that action. So keep that in mind. Additionally, when assessing the effectiveness of LEA-wide and school-wide actions that are contributing to the requirement to increase or improve services, LEAs must use the metrics that are associated with those LEA-wide and school-wide actions as identified in the increased or improved services section of the LCAP. Those have to be part of the analysis of effectiveness or ineffectiveness. If you put down some metrics in the increased or improved services section that were related to how you were going to implement, or how you were going to determine the effectiveness of an LEA-wide or a school-wide action, and you get the results back, and those results are worse than what you thought they would be, or they're, again, showing that there's not any positive change related to that LEA-wide metric. You can't just discount that and not include that as part of the analysis of effectiveness or ineffectiveness. That has to be part of the determination. And along with that, LEAs can use additional measures of progress, including input from educational partners that's not specified in the LCAP, when they're identifying the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of actions within the plan. So keep those things in mind when you're looking at describing effectiveness or ineffectiveness, especially for those LEA-wide and school-wide contributing actions. And then prompt 4. Prompt 4 is a description of any changes made to the planned goal, metrics, desired outcomes, or actions for the coming year that resulted from reflections on prior practice. When we look at the instructions ask us to describe any changes made to the goal, expected outcomes, metrics, or actions to achieve the goal as a result of the analysis and analysis of the data provided in the dashboard and other local data as applicable. The instructions go on to note related to what we've talked about, that actions that have not been effective over 3 years have to be changed. For those particular actions, you have to identify the reasons for ineffectiveness and how the changes to the action will result in a new or strengthened approach. But as we've discussed already, in general, this is not going to apply to the majority of LEAs because we're going into year 2. We're reviewing year 1 of the 3-year cycle. And so we're not going to be at that 3-year period in order to be able to determine whether or not the action was effective or ineffective, and require that statutory change. Some points to consider. First of all, as I've already discussed, you're not going to be required to change actions that are identified as ineffective. You can change them if you want. You can make adjustments to them. You can make course corrections, and have some flexibility there around how to do that. But you're not required to. However, I do want to make it clear that if there's any changes being made to the goal, that has to be documented in the response. One of the things that we've seen or that we've heard from community members is that an LCAP will say, "Oh, we're not making any changes to the goal, but we're taking out a particular action, and we're going to make that we're shifting some funding sources around, and we're going to renumber some of the metrics in order to do things." But none of those changes are actually being described in this 4th prompt. If there are changes that are being made to the goal, to the actions, to the goal, to the metrics within the goal, those need to be described in this prompt. This is one of the ways that the LEAs can really help provide that transparency that's part of the idea of subsidiarity, that they're working to build trusting relationships by being transparent in the things that they're doing and calling out the changes that have been made. Whether that's funding for a particular action has shifted from one funding source to another funding source, whether that's we're removing some certain student groups from a particular metric, or any other thing like that. Those are things that need to be called out within this 4th prompt. So let's talk about the update process, the process of updating the LCAP itself. We kind of outlined here 5 steps related to the annual update process. The first of which is to assess the implementation of the actions. Look at how have they been implemented. Then we're going to gather and analyze data related to performance. We're going to review estimated actuals. So we're going to look at the fiscal data. Then we're going to use all of that in order to evaluate the effectiveness. And then we're going to determine what changes, if any, needs to be made based on that evaluation. So let's walk through each step. Within step 1, where we're assessing the implementation, what data and educational and partner input have informed the assessment of implementation? When we're talking to, are we talking to our teachers about how a particular program has been implemented? Our classroom aides, are we talking to students and parents and getting their perspectives? Then determining what overall implementation looked like. What did that look like? And then what were the challenges and successes that were part of that initial implementation? then what are the instances where the LEA did not implement a planned action? And what actions were they that were not implemented? And then any instances where our delivery of a particular service, differed substantively from how it was described in the LCAP. If the LCAP talks about we're going to hire a reading specialist, but we can't find anybody to hire, and so instead we kind of shift things around and we utilize some classroom aides to do push-in support and help in order to address some of those reading issues at school. That's potentially a substantive change in how that action was delivered, based when we compare it to what the plan originally stated. So we're taking all of that information, we're using it to inform that first prompt, but we're also using it to inform, whether or not, like related to the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of the action. Because sometimes, if we're not implementing something with fidelity, it's not going to be successful. Whereas if it is implemented with fidelity, it does show success. So that's part of that determination. In step 2, we're looking specifically at data. We're looking at data from the California School Dashboard and DataQuest at the state level. We're also looking at what data was gathered locally. And then another source of data that should be included in this is data that's gathered related to the review of the local indicator implementation. The local indicators and the analysis of implementation that goes along with them is supposed to be backed up with data. So using that data and pulling that in as well, and then using that data along with other state and local data in order to identify what's happened during the year. Also, what feedback have educational partners shared, and what data is being collected to report as part of the mid-year update? And have we disaggregated the data based on low income, English learner, foster youth, our 3 unduplicated student groups, or other student subgroups? All of that information, all of that data then goes into informing our analysis of effectiveness, as well as informing, what sorts of adjustments might be needed moving forward. It also, goes into reporting out the year 1 outcomes, because a lot of our year 1 outcomes are tied to these data. Step 3, we're reviewing our estimated actuals. We're looking at the fiscal data. So what were the expenditures for each action? Or were the expenditures for each action the same as the amount that was originally budgeted? In a lot of instances, there's going to be minor variations. But, if there's a significant difference, that's something that needs to be taken into account. What were the reasons for the expenditures being significantly different, if there are those significant differences? Were there planned percentages to improve service? Were the planned percentages to improve service the same as what was planned? Not very many LEAs use those at this point in time. If you're one of the ones that does, considering that as part of this evaluation, and then what caused the increase or the decrease in those percentages to improve service. Again, this will help us in responding to that second prompt, but it also goes into the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of particular actions. And then we're going to use all of the data and the information that we've collected in the first 3 steps in order to evaluate effectiveness in step 4. We're going to identify whether or not each action was effective or ineffective towards making progress towards the goal. if we're looking at grouped actions and metrics, what stands out? What sort of information is jumping out? And are there any trends that are related to effective actions or ineffective actions? Obviously, there's some trends that you're going to see where an initiative is has been well invested in. It's been implemented with fidelity, and it's being monitored using multiple measures, both at the state level and the local level. You're going to probably see that's got more effectiveness to it than something that's missing one of those pieces. If an action is underfunded, if it's not being implemented with fidelity, it's less likely to be effective. Also, what input have educational partners provided related to whether or not something is effective or ineffective? Sometimes we're going to have instances where the data isn't showing any improvement. The data itself, it's not showing that things have gotten worse, but it's not showing that things have gotten better. But we've got that anecdotal information, that qualitative data, if you will, that educational partners provide, saying this is something that has made a positive impact for my student, or this is something that has made a positive impact in our classroom or our school climate. And that can be just as important in terms of determining effectiveness as what the outcome data from state and local sources says as well. And then based on all of this evaluation, what gaps need to be addressed? How is it that we can take this information and make adjustments to the plan in order to try to address the concerns that we've discovered? Now, one of the things that I think needs to be pointed out at this point in time is in the vast majority of instances, in year 2 of the 3-year cycle, we're not looking to make huge changes to the plan. We want that plan to continue and to be implemented, because it's going to need time to be implemented fully. What we really want to do, though, is identify areas where things aren't being implemented with fidelity, or they don't have the resources that they need in order to be successful. If we're setting our students up for failure by not fully implementing a particular program, why are we implementing that program? Let's ensure that it's got the resources that it needs in order to make the impact on student outcomes that we want it to have. And so this is that opportunity to address those, to plug those gaps, to identify where they are and plug them up so that they can, in the years that come, be able to really have the impact that we want them to have. And then step 5 is that determining changes. When we're talking about the changes, what changes are needed to the planned goal, if any? Are there changes that are needed to metrics or to target outcomes? Do we need to reevaluate things? Some LEAs implemented some new metrics in year 1 and had target outcomes. Now that you have actual data, do you need to go back and revise those target outcomes based on the data that you've already got? Those are things to consider. Also, how has input from educational partners helped to determine what changes to make? Because that information there can be used as part of your engaging educational partners response in terms of how their input impacted the LCAP. It can also be something that's used in determining or in explaining the changes around why particular changes were made as opposed to making other changes. What are there actions for the coming year that resulted from reflections on prior practice? And if an action is ineffective, what are the reasons for the ineffectiveness? These are all things that we need to kind of consider, that we need to wrestle with in order to ensure that we're going to be making positive movement towards achieving the goals that we have in the plan. And then how might the changes result in a new or strengthened approach? Again, in instances where actions have to be changed, that's a requirement. You have to call that out if it's been ineffective for 3 years. Otherwise, it's a best practice to look at how changes might result in a new or strengthened approach. We don't want to change things if we don't have an idea about what that change is going to do. Just as a reminder, review the LCAP instructions. We've gone over them, but keep those in mind because the prompts in the LCAP template don't contain all of the required information that you need in order to respond. Also, please remember to address the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of all of the actions within the goal. And we'll go into some closing thoughts here, and then we'll respond to some of the questions here that are in the chat and the Q&A. Just a couple of things to consider. Remember to review educational partner, to engage educational partners in the review of data. They have their unique perspectives that they bring, and it's important to get their input on why there might be particular results showing up. It's also, potentially going to be important in terms of identifying whether or not an action is effective or ineffective, just because, again, they might see things in a different light and be able to identify that actions are being effective or that actions are being ineffective based on what it is that they're seeing. Also, we want to encourage everybody to utilize ongoing processes in order to inform the analysis of the goals. A lot of times we kind of take things in a siloed way, and we approach things one piece at a time. What's going on with your process for engaging educational partners? What's going on with evaluating the data based on the local indicators or evaluating your dashboard data? What's going on related to any differentiated assistance work that you have going on, as well as the data that's being collected in order to inform the mid-year update. All of that can be used in order to inform the goal analysis. And if it's being done all at the same time, that information can be readily gleaned and available, and you're not duplicating effort. So try and make sure that when you're doing these things, you're making the best use of the time and the resources that you have, and getting all of that done concurrently. And then we've put in a link here to some resources for sustaining continuous improvement. There are a number of resources that are available off of that link on the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence's webpage. They've been developed by county offices of education related to looking at data and being able to identify positive and negative areas of change, as well as some of them focus more on local level data, some of them focus on state level data. But if you're wondering, okay, how can I dig in? How can I take a deeper look? Consider looking and checking out some of these resources that are available on that page. So at this point, before we get into upcoming webinars, I'll go ahead and pause and look over some of these questions that have come in. So there's a question in here about does the LEA need to address implementation on all actions, action by action in prompt 1, or just overall implementation? That's up to the LEA. Overall implementation is certainly what is called out in the requirement related to the instructions and to the prompt itself. Calling out in the implementation of individual actions really provides a lot of that context that I was referring to earlier. It also provides more transparency related to how things were implemented. And so, there's pros and cons each way. Obviously, if you are doing it on a one-by-one basis, you're going to have a longer plan. If you're doing it on using more of an overall description, you might lose some of the specificity and the details that would be beneficial to somebody else who's looking at the plan, whether that's your reviewer or whether that's the educational partners that you work with and that you serve. Another question here, for equity multiplier goals, if the goal was deemed to be effective, the schools and student groups are no longer in the red, do we keep the goal? Possibly. I would say that it probably depends on whether or not the school is still receiving equity multiplier funds. If the school or schools are still receiving equity multiplier funds, then you're going to want to keep the goal. The goal, and we'll talk about this a lot more at our webinar related to equity multiplier goals on January 7th. But given the changes, potential changes and shifts that take place based on the dashboard data and which student groups are lowest performing, you might see some significant shifts within what that equity multiplier goal is required to address. In those sorts of instances, you're going to want to keep the goal. You might strip out the student groups that are no longer lowest performing. Add in new student groups. You might shift the focus from one indicator to another indicator. It's not going to be necessarily clean or pretty, unfortunately. But we'll talk through that and hopefully provide you with some examples of what that might look like at that webinar on the 7th. Another question, if the LEA needs to update target outcomes for metrics, are they required to explain that in the goal analysis? Yes, if they're updating target outcomes, that's a change to the goal. If anything changes within the goal, it needs to be called out in that 4th prompt of changes being made to the goal. So if the target outcomes are updated, that change needs to be explained in that 4th prompt of the goal analysis. There's a question in here about, does every action have to be addressed individually in prompt 1 as well? We've already discussed that. That's not necessarily the requirement there. It's an option for LEAs, but the prompt itself talks about overall implementation of the actions. Is there a timeline for presentation due dates? No, there is not. The two timelines that you have are for one, the mid-year update, which has to be done on or before February 28th, and two, the adoption of the LCAP, which has to be done on or before July 1st of each year. Those are the only two timelines or deadlines, as it were, as it relates to the LCAP. Other than that, LEAs have flexibility on when certain things within the process take place. Another question, for equity multiplier goals, if the goal was deemed effective, oh, that's already been answered. So moving on, if we have to determine if each action is effective or ineffective, how do you suggest we deal with this, since this is just at the end of year one of the 3-year cycle? It's okay to say ineffective and keep the action, right? Yes, it is. So here, this is kind of what I was talking about earlier. We're going to identify in the third prompt there, we're going to identify whether or not each of the actions is effective or ineffective. That identification of whether the action is effective or ineffective does not force any change at this point in time. You can identify an action as ineffective and continue to implement it as it's designed and continue to monitor it using the same metrics and continue to analyze that over the next 2 years. If we get to the end of year 3 in the LCAP cycle, so that would be the end of the 26-27 school year. If we get to the end of the 26-27 school year and we're looking at it, and in each of the 3 years of the cycle, there's not anything in the data or the educational partner feedback that shows that that particular action has been helpful at all towards achieving the goal, then that action is ineffective. On the other hand, if we see something, if we do see increases, or I don't necessarily want to say increases, because in some instances decreases are a good thing. So let's just say positive outcomes. If there's positive outcomes that we're seeing during that 3-year cycle, then that gives us an indication that given the right conditions, given the appropriate level of funding, given the implementation of the action with fidelity, it does lead to improved outcomes for students. So when you're looking at identifying effectiveness or ineffectiveness at this point in time, as doing the goal analysis for the 24-25 goals, don't feel like just because an action is ineffective, that means you can't include it or that you have to change it in some way, shape, or form. That's not the case. So we've gone through, I think, the majority of the questions. Just a reminder of our upcoming webinars. I already touched on those. If you have a question for us that we haven't gotten to, that you'd like a response to, please feel free to email us at lcff@cde.ca.gov. If you have if you need information on these webinars, you can find that at our Tuesday at 2 webpage. And we thank you for being here. We appreciate everything that you all do in your work with students and families, and all of the great things that you all do on a daily basis. So thank you for taking time out and for being here with us. And we wish you a good day.